They say there's nothing like the peace of a quiet morning by the lake. Well, I found out the hard way that peace isn't just rare, it's apparently illegal now. Picture this. I'm sitting there, fishing rod in hand, Boone, my dog, at my feet, when suddenly a woman I'd never met marches straight onto my property like she owns the place. She points at my fishing pole and declares that I'm violating the aesthetic harmony of the lake. I mean, who knew that casting a line could be considered a crime against suburban civilization? That's how I met Marlene Clayton, the president of the Pinewood Estates HOA, full-time menace and part-time neighborhood dictator. I was just trying to enjoy some fresh air on the land my family has owned for 3 generations, but apparently fresh air and peace are now on the HOA's most wanted list. Then, as if that wasn't enough, she calls the cops on me. Yep, on my own land. You can imagine how well that went over. Leave a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. If you love wild, true-to-life stories packed with twists, justice, and just the right amount of HOA chaos, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's story is even more jaw-dropping, and trust me, the surprises coming next, you won't want to miss them. My name's Jack Harper, and this lakefront isn't just a pretty patch of water to me. It's legacy, home, the kind of place where every oak tree and ripple tells a story. My grandfather planted those trees, and Boone and I have been coming out here every weekend for years. The land's been in my family since 1947, long before the fancy houses popped up next door. About 6 months ago, the Pinewood Estates development started sprouting like weeds along the border. I figured the new neighbors would keep to themselves, mind their business. How wrong I was. Turns out, the HOA president, Marlene, has very different ideas about what's her business, and it includes policing my weekend camping trips. She shows up one Saturday morning dressed like she's on her way to a board meeting and tells me my campsite is an eyesore, something that's not in keeping with neighborhood standards. I looked around at my folding chair, the small tent, the cooler, and thought, "Lady, the only thing not in keeping here is your attitude." I tried to keep it civil because, honestly, I just wanted to fish in peace. "Marlene," I said, "this land belongs to my family. I'm not breaking any laws, just enjoying what's rightfully mine." But she smiled that smile, you know, the kind that doesn't quite reach the eyes and has a sharp edge to it. She dropped some legal jargon about community interests and cooperation, which sounded less like a suggestion and more like a demand, dressed up in a fancy suit. And then she warned me about property values, county inspections, and other ways she could make life difficult if I didn't play nice. It was the kind of threat that's barely disguised as a warning, like when someone says, "Bless your heart," and you know it's anything but. Boone growled low beside me, picking up on the tension better than I was. I told her flat out, this was my land, and if she had a problem, she could take it up with my lawyer. For a moment, I thought she might storm off, but instead she gave me a shark's grin and said, "We'll be speaking again soon." Yeah, that was the last time I thought I'd be sitting quietly by the lake. A few days later, I came out to find a no trespassing sign planted smack in the middle of my own property, right by the water's edge. I swear Boone looked like he was ready to declare war, his tail stiff, eyes locked on that sign like it was a red flag. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just a bad neighbor dispute anymore. Marlene wasn't just difficult. She'd declared war. The kind of war where the other side doesn't just send letters, but security guards too. It was the beginning of something bigger. A chess game I didn't sign up to play. But I was about to learn that sometimes the quietest guy on the lake has a few tricks up his sleeve. And believe me, this was just the opening move. The next morning, I stepped outside and noticed something that made my stomach drop faster than a bass on a fishing line. A big, bold, "No trespassing" sign planted right on my own lakefront. It was like Marlene had flipped a switch overnight from polite pest to full-blown siege commander. Boone, my loyal four-legged partner in crime, stiffened immediately, ears pricked, tail low. The kind of body language that says, "Something's coming," and it ain't friendly. Couldn't help but think of Marlene as a shark circling, flashing teeth disguised behind that sweet, polished smile. And the worst part? This was just the opening salvo. You could almost feel the tide turning, pulling my peaceful weekends into a whirlpool I wasn't sure I'd escape. A couple of days later, Marlene showed up again, only this time she brought reinforcements. 2 private security guards rolled in behind her, black polos embroidered with pinewood security glinting in the morning sun like armor. The whole scene felt less like a neighborhood meeting and more like a well-rehearsed act in some absurd drama. Boone growled low, but I had to keep him calm, reminding myself that barking might make me look guilty. Watching Marlene stride onto my property with that perfectly practiced "I'm in charge" swagger, I realized this wasn't about community standards anymore. It was about power and intimidation. And I wasn't about to be the scared homeowner they expected. But just how far were they willing to push? That question hung in the air, thicker than the Texas humidity. Marlene's words came coated with honey, but each syllable had the sting of a well-sharpened knife. She pointed at my campsite, folding chairs, a cooler, my fishing gear, as if they were weapons of mass destruction. "Mr. Harper," she said, voice dripping with false sweetness, "you're tampering with community property. I have to ask you to leave immediately." I held up my hands, trying to sound calm but firm. "Marlene, this is my land. You have no right to post signs or bring security onto my property without permission." The guards shifted, silent but menacing, like shadows waiting to strike. It was the kind of moment where you realize the polite mask is just that, a mask, and behind it lurks a very different game. I wondered, what would it take for this polite performance to snap, because when it does, there's no going back. As I stood there, watching the guard's eyes narrow and Marlene's smile flicker for the briefest moment, I thought about how HOA disputes often spiral from small annoyances into full-blown battles. It's like a snowball rolling down a hill, picking up speed and weight until it's an avalanche you never saw coming. From a missing mailbox flag to signs on private land, what starts as petty enforcement becomes a campaign of harassment, and somehow the people wielding the power convince themselves they're the good guys, the guardians of community harmony. But for the rest of us caught in the crossfire, it feels a lot more like being hunted. Boone's growl reminded me that survival meant staying sharp and standing my ground no matter how uncomfortable the spotlight got. But the question remained, what was Marlene really after? Later that night, I sat on my porch with Boone at my feet, the "No Trespassing" sign glaring at me from across the yard like a challenge. I mulled over the day's events, trying to piece together Marlene's real agenda. Was it just about neighborhood appearance, or was something bigger lurking beneath the surface? The calm surface of the lake hid depths I wasn't ready to explore yet. One thing was clear, Marlene wasn't just an overzealous HOA president. She was playing a longer, more dangerous game. And I had just been pulled into her strategy without even realizing it. What lay ahead was no longer a battle over camping spots. It was a fight for control. And trust me, this is where the real story begins. Stick around, you'll want to hear what I uncovered next. I dove headfirst into the kind of paperwork that makes most folks' eyes glaze over faster than a donut at a police station. Public records, property transfers, tax filings, the dry stuff that usually hides the juicy secrets. What I found wasn't just a coincidence. It was a pattern so cold and calculated it felt like watching a chess grandmaster manipulate pawns who didn't even know they were in a game. Marlene's husband, Tom Clayton, ran Clayton Construction like a well-oiled machine, snapping up lakefront properties at prices that made me question if the owners even knew what was happening. The HOA, supposedly protecting the neighborhood, was just the opening act for a carefully choreographed property grab. Boone lay nearby, silent but alert, as if he knew this was no ordinary backyard dispute. This was war by paperwork. As I sifted through case after case, the story started to paint itself in shades of corporate greed, dressed up in community care, retired couples selling their cabins after months of relentless complaints, young families giving up their dreams because of endless violations and legal threats, all signs pointing to the same playbook. It was like a slow-motion heist where the burglars wore HOA badges and wielded bylaws instead of crowbars. The more I uncovered, the heavier the weight settled in my chest. This wasn't just about me or my weekend fishing trips. This was a predator stalking its prey, and I was smack in the middle of the feeding grounds. The realization hit hard. I wasn't just fighting a neighbor. I was up against a seasoned property shark. The whole scheme was wrapped in layers of legalese and community charm, making it nearly invisible to anyone not willing to dig deep. It reminded me of those magic shows where the magician distracts you with one hand while the other is busy pulling the rabbit out of the hat. Marlene and Tom had mastered that trick, convincing the neighborhood they were guardians of peace while quietly pushing people out and lining their pockets. Boone, ever the loyal sidekick, seemed to sense the urgency in my movements, nudging my hand like to say, "We've got to outsmart these guys before they swallow us whole." And just like that, I felt that classic David versus Goliath moment creeping in, where the odds are stacked, but the underdog still has a chance if he plays it smart. It became clear that this fight wasn't just about property lines or noisy campers. It was about exposing a system designed to corner, coerce, and cash in. And me? I was the unexpected opponent who wasn't ready to fold. The thought of losing my family's land, the same land that had seen decades of hard work and memories, lit a fire under me that no HOA letter or security guard could extinguish. But as the mountain of evidence grew, so did the tension. Could one man, armed with little more than determination, a camera, and a stubborn dog, really stand up to a well-funded legal machine? That question kept me awake more nights than I'd like to admit. By the time I closed the last file and looked out at the darkening lake, Boone at my side, I knew the game had changed. Marlene wasn't just some overzealous neighbor anymore. She was a player in a high-stakes game, where the rules were written by the powerful and the rest of us were just pieces on the board. But here's the thing about chess. Even the biggest king can be toppled by a well-placed pawn, and I was ready to make my move. Stick around, because this is where things get interesting. And trust me, you're going to want to see how I plan to turn the tables on this HOA operation. I realized early on that if I wanted to stand a chance against Marlene and her legal muscle, I had to stop fighting shadows and start arming myself with facts. So I called in Bill, a county surveyor with a reputation as solid as the oak trees lining my property. This guy had been marking lines in East Texas since before I was born, and when he showed up with his weathered boots and old-school equipment, I felt like a general preparing for battle, except my weapons were boundary markers and legal documents instead of rifles. Watching Bill work, placing those bright orange stakes firmly into the earth, I could almost hear the silent declaration, "This land is ours, and we're not backing down." Boone, ever the vigilant sentry, patrolled the edges, barking at squirrels like tiny intruders, keeping the mood light even as the stakes climbed higher. Next came the high-tech upgrades, something Marlene's team wouldn't see coming. I installed a security camera system that would make any reality show jealous. 4 high-definition cameras with night vision, wireless feeds, and a digital recorder tucked safely inside the house. It was like turning my humble lakefront into Fort Knox. Minus the armed guards, but with Boone as chief of security. As I screwed the last camera into place, Boone chased off a particularly bold squirrel, sending it scurrying up a tree in a flurry of leaves and twigs. It was a funny reminder that while this battle was serious, life on the lake still had its moments of simple joy. Still, every new camera felt like a small victory, a brick added to the fortress protecting my family's legacy from being bulldozed by greed and corruption. Preparing this defense was more than just setting up gear. It was about sending a message not just to Marlene, but to myself. In the quiet moments, I pictured this whole thing as a siege, with me as a lone general fortifying a stronghold against an army of legal papers and intimidation. Each survey stake was a line in the sand, each camera an eye watching for threats. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a guy who just wanted to fish in peace, suddenly running a tactical operation worthy of a spy thriller. Boone seemed to sense the gravity too, staying close and occasionally nipping at my boots as if to say, "We got this, boss." But I couldn't shake the question hanging in the air. Would these preparations be enough? Or had Marlene already planned her next move to break through my defenses? Weeks passed with a tense calm, like the quiet before a storm. Then came the letter, official-looking, intimidating, and dripping with accusations of community violations, like noise complaints and fire hazards. The Pinewood Community Standards Board, a name so bureaucratic it might as well have been the committee for making Jack's life miserable, demanded I appear before them or face enforcement actions. Reading those pages, filled with complaints written in eerily similar handwriting and language, was almost comical if it weren't so clearly a setup. Marlene was building her paper trail, stacking evidence that painted me as the neighborhood villain, but for me, it was a signal that this wasn't just a spat. It was a full-blown campaign. Boone gave a low growl, his way of reminding me that the fight was far from over. As I sat back on the porch that evening, the sun setting over the lake casting long shadows, I realized something crucial. Preparation was my greatest weapon. Marlene's moves were aggressive, sure, but mine were calculated. I was no longer the passive neighbor. I was a defender of legacy, armed with knowledge, technology, and a stubborn heart. And while Boone chased squirrels and kept watch, I plotted the next chapter in this story, a story where the underdog learns the rules, gathers his strength, and gets ready to turn the tide. What happens next? Well, let's just say Marlene's about to find out that the quiet lakeside isn't so peaceful anymore. Stay tuned. If you found this story or the lessons in it helpful, please send it to a friend who might be facing the same kind of battle. Sharing this could be the spark they need to stand up for what's right. And don't forget to leave a comment below. I want to hear what you think about Jack's fight and if you've ever dealt with a situation like this yourself. Not long after tightening my defenses, I started noticing a new player in this little drama. A dark SUV parked just outside my property line, like a shadow lurking where it shouldn't be. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining things, or that someone was just passing through. But Boone, ever the sharper nose in the room, started growling every time that SUV showed up, his eyes tracking it like a hawk stalking prey. It didn't take long before I realized this wasn't random. Someone was watching, waiting, trying to find my next move before I even made it. The irony? While Marlene's HOA accused me of invading privacy with my cameras, here they were spying on me like Big Brother himself had a new favorite target. The double standard was so thick you could slice it with a knife, and I had every intention of documenting it all. Then came the letters. Oh, the letters. Those official-looking notes dripping with faux concern. The HOA claimed my camera system was a violation of residents' privacy, accusing me of turning my peaceful lakefront into a surveillance nightmare aimed at community members. I couldn't help but chuckle. It was like getting a ticket for speeding while they're tailgating you at twice the limit. Here I was, simply protecting my own land, and they painted me as some kind of villainous spy. I kept every letter, every complaint form, stacking them like a fortress of paperwork, because if there's one thing HOA bullies don't like, it's when their dirty laundry gets aired in front of witnesses. Boone seemed to understand this too, lounging nearby with a satisfied wag of his tail as if to say, "Gotcha." Paranoia? Sure, it crept in, but I didn't let it swallow me whole. Instead, I turned detective, keeping a log of every suspicious moment, license plates, times, locations, anything that might expose the watchers for what they really were, hired eyes in a legal cloak-and-dagger game. I even caught the man in the SUV stepping onto my property a couple of times, not realizing my hidden cameras were capturing every move. It was like watching a bad spy flick where the villain forgets the hero has night vision goggles. Every photo, every timestamp became a piece of armor against the creeping tide of intimidation. Boone stayed close, his steady presence a reminder that even in the shadows, I wasn't alone. But I had to wonder, how far was Marlene willing to push before this game turned ugly? This whole saga taught me one crucial lesson: documentation is your best friend when facing harassment. Words get twisted, accusations fly, and without proof, you're fighting ghosts. But with records, photos, and a clear timeline, you turn the tables, forcing the other side to play by rules they often try to ignore. It's like shining a flashlight into a dark room. Suddenly, nothing can hide. And in this game, knowledge is power, and patience is a weapon. Boone and I spent hours reviewing footage, making notes, and preparing for the inevitable next move. The tension was thick, but so was my resolve. I wasn't about to be the victim of a shadow campaign without a fight. As I settled into this uneasy watchfulness, the question burned brighter with every passing day. How far would Marlene and her HOA harassment escalate before I decided to strike back? This wasn't just about property lines or nuisance complaints anymore. It was a battle of wills, a psychological chess match where each move had real consequences. And while Boone barked at every rustle in the brush, I prepared for the moment when silence would break and the fight would go public. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this story unfolds. Stay with me. The next chapter's coming, and it's where the real tension begins to snap. One afternoon, I got a letter from Tom Clayton, Marlene's husband and the real puppet master behind Pinewood Estates. The letter was polite, too polite, wrapped in fancy legal jargon promising amicable resolution and community harmony. But make no mistake, it was a classic lowball offer, asking me to sell my family's land for far less than it was worth. The velvet glove hiding the iron fist of their greed was on full display. They thought a stack of fancy paper would make me fold. Spoiler, it didn't. Reading that letter felt like watching a con artist put on a slick suit before trying to rob your house. Months of harassment, surveillance, and threats, and now this? An offer disguised as neighborly kindness, but really just an insult wrapped in legalese. I folded the letter with a knowing smile and started plotting my next move. This wasn't about politely saying no. It was about turning the tables on their little game. The real power play was about to begin. And I was going to call the shots. I gathered every piece of ammunition I had. Survey stakes proving my property lines, security footage catching their hired watchers trespassing, and a mountain of HOA complaints and lawsuits showing a pattern of harassment. It was no longer just a land dispute, it was a battle against a well-oiled intimidation machine. Boone stayed close, alert, and ready. This wasn't about giving up. It was about exposing the whole scheme for what it was. My plan was simple but sharp. Stay calm, collect evidence, and let the legal team do its work. I needed Marlene and Tom to keep underestimating me, thinking I'd cave under pressure. But behind the scenes, we were building a case that would not only protect my land, but also take down their dirty tactics. Watching their confidence start to crack? That was my kind of satisfaction. But would they back down, or would they double down on the harassment? This fight was bigger than just me. It was a lesson for anyone facing this kind of bullying disguised as community standards. Lowball offers, backed by threats, are meant to wear you down. But I wasn't about to quit. I was ready to show them that even the smallest guy can outsmart the biggest shark. And if you think the story's about to calm down, trust me, the real showdown is coming. Stick around. The night Marlene showed up with Officer Reynolds at the lake felt like stepping into a courtroom drama I hadn't auditioned for. There I was, standing beside the official survey markers that Bill had planted, Boone pacing quietly, when Marlene sashayed in like she already owned the place. Officer Reynolds looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Caught between a rock and the velvet glove hiding Marlene's iron fist, I held my folder tight, filled with every piece of evidence I'd gathered. Survey maps, trespassing videos, documented harassment. The question hanging in the air was as clear as the lake water before me. When truth meets tyranny, who holds the final verdict? Marlene wasted no time spinning her web of lies, painting me as a trespasser and menace to community safety. She leaned into her role like a seasoned actress, her voice honey-sweet but with a razor's edge beneath. Officer Reynolds glanced at me, then at the evidence, his posture shifting from skepticism to curiosity. That's when I started presenting my case, calmly but firmly, showing the boundary markers that marked my rightful land, the videos of her operatives crossing those lines, and the mountain of complaints she'd filed to harass me. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, but my voice stayed steady. because I knew this was the moment everything could change. Watching Marlene's confident mask begin to crack was almost surreal. It was like watching a house of cards wobble on a windy porch, each piece of evidence threatening to bring it all tumbling down. Officer Reynolds' eyes narrowed as he reviewed the footage and documents, the reality sinking in that he'd been caught in the middle of a manipulated narrative. Boone, sensing the shift, gave a low, approving bark as if to say, "We're winning this." The scene was no longer just a dispute over land, it was a reckoning. But would the law bend toward justice or buckle under the weight of HOA influence? The drama reached a crescendo when Officer Reynolds finally spoke up, his tone cool and official. He informed Marlene that filing false reports with law enforcement was a serious offense, and that her repeated accusations were now under investigation. He asked for explanations about the trespassing evidence, effectively putting her on the defensive for the first time. Marlene faltered, her sharp tongue dulled by the mounting proof. The power balance was shifting, and for once, the bully was the one under the spotlight. The weight of the law was beginning to tip the scales, and it was exhilarating. As the night wore on and the official notes were taken, I felt a sense of hope that maybe, just maybe, this fight wasn't a losing battle after all. Marlene's reign of intimidation was cracking, exposed by prepared evidence and the calm determination of one man and his dog. But this was only the beginning of a longer legal war. The question remained, would justice prevail in the end, or would power and influence find a way to silence the truth? That's a story for another chapter, but trust me, you won't want to miss how it all unfolds. Stick around. Months later, the tide finally turned. Marlene's carefully built empire of intimidation and deceit began to crumble under the weight of truth and the law. She faced legal consequences, fines, a criminal record for filing false reports, and the kind of public humiliation that no amount of HOA charm could cover up. The Pinewood Estates HOA saw a change in leadership, and for the first time in years, the community breathed easier. It was like the lion finally laid down the hunter's spear, exhausted from the chase and forced to retreat. Boone and I sat by the lake one evening, watching the sunset paint the water golden, feeling the heavy burden of this battle slowly lift. The financial settlement wasn't just a win, it was a statement, a clear message that bullies who hide behind rules and regulations to bully others will eventually be held accountable. The HOA paid damages, Marlene chipped in personally, and, more importantly, my family's legacy was restored and respected. That lakefront wasn't just a piece of land anymore. It was a symbol of standing firm in the face of unfairness. And Boone? Well, he chased more squirrels than ever, as if celebrating his own little victory in the war. There's something satisfying about seeing justice served with a side of playful dog antics. But the real victory went beyond money or legal papers. It was the hope and encouragement it sparked, not just for me, but for anyone who's ever been pushed around by a system rigged in favor of the powerful. This fight reminded me that knowledge, courage, and persistence are the tools that level the playing field. You don't have to be a lawyer or a millionaire to stand up for what's right. You just have to be smart enough to gather your facts and stubborn enough to keep going. If Boone and I could do it, so can you. Reflecting on everything, I realized the battle had changed me. I'm no longer the quiet neighbor who just wanted a peaceful weekend by the lake. I became part of a bigger story, a story about standing up to bullies and fighting for justice, even when the odds seem stacked. And that's a story worth telling over and over. So if you're facing a fight like this, know you're not alone, and remember, sometimes the smallest voices carry the loudest truths. If this story resonated with you, share it with a friend who might need a reminder that they can win their own battles. Leave a comment below and tell me your story. Because these fights don't just end on one property line. They echo in every neighborhood, every community. And trust me, there's plenty more stories like this waiting to be told. Stick around, you won't want to miss what's coming next. As I sat there by the lake, watching Boone chase fireflies under the fading light, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not just because I won, but because standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, truly pays off. This story isn't just about land or lawsuits, it's about courage, persistence, and knowing your worth in the face of unfairness. If there's one lesson to take away, it's this: never let intimidation silence you, and always gather your evidence before you fight back. Justice might take time, but when it comes, it's sweeter than you ever imagined. If this story struck a chord with you, please hit that like button and leave a comment sharing what you learned or how you'd handle a situation like Jack's. Your voice matters, and sharing your experiences helps others realize they're not alone. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story that brings truth, hope, and a little bit of justice to light. We've got plenty more tales that will inspire and maybe even surprise you. Thanks for listening. See you in the next episode. What would you like to see next? Drop a comment below and let me know which stories or topics you want me to cover. Your ideas help shape the channel, and when I create videos on demand just for you, it makes this community stronger and more connected. So don't be shy. Tell me what's on your mind.